The richest female CEO in Chicago threw a construction worker out of her luxury gala because his boots were dirty.
Snow hammered
but
against
less
the
than
streets
1 hour
of Chicago
later,
hard
that
enough
same
to
man
erase
would
the
expose
skyline
the
beyond the
secret
apartment
capable
windows,
of destroying her
the city looked
billion-dollar
blurred,
empire.
cold
As
and
corruption,
exhausted,
betrayal,
like everyone
and
inside
deadly
it was simply
construction
trying
fraud
to
begin
survive
to
another
surface,
winter morning.
Victoria Hayes
Daniel
realizes
Brooks
the company
stood in
she
the
spent
narrow
her life
kitchen of his
building
South Side
was
apartment
founded on lies.
staring at the coffee
And the
maker
only person
had standing
personally
beside him
betrayed him
is the man she
It
humiliated
sputtered
in front of everyone.
coughed steam. Before
then
we
died
begin,
completely.
share where you're watching from. And if this story stirs
He muttered
something in
under his
you,
breath.
subscribe for more
Absolutely
stories of honor,
perfect timing.
sacrifice. At 38,
Your support
Daniel had
truly
the kind
means
of
the world.
face life carved instead
Snow
of shaped.
pressed against the windows
Sharp
of the
jawline
Blackstone
hidden
Hotel
beneath
like
uneven
ash
stubble,
blown across
tired
glass.
gray blue
Downtown
eyes
Chicago
shadowed by
shimmered
too many
below in
sleepless
white
nights.
and gold.
Dark
Cold
brown
enough
hair
to make
that
the
curled
streets look
slightly at the
empty,
ends
even at
because
7
he
in the
never
evening.
had time to cut it
Victoria
properly
Hayes
anymore.
stood near the ballroom
He was
entrance,
broad-shouldered
with
from
one
years
hand
of warehouse
wrapped around a
labor,
champagne
but
flute
exhaustion
she
had
had
thinned
thinned
him
him
recently,
recently,
drinking.
pulling
At
tension
34,
tight across his
she had
features.
become the youngest
People used
CEO
to describe
in
him
the
as
history of
intimidating
Hayes
before
they
they heard him
development.
speak.
A real estate company
Then they noticed how
powerful enough to
gentle he
decide
was with
which
everyone
neighborhoods
except
survived
himself,
and which ones
especially
disappeared
with
under
his
steel
daughter.
and glass. She was
Dad?
tall,
A
almost
small voice
strikingly
called.
so, with a
Daniel
narrow
turned
waist
toward
and
the
long
hallway,
posture sharpened
just
by
as Lily
years of
Brooks
discipline,
shuffled
rather
into the
than
kitchen,
vanity. Wearing
her dark
oversized
auburn
pink
hair
socks
rested
and a
neatly
yellow
against
sweater
one
covered
shoulder
in
in
tiny
controlled
embroidered
waves,
stars.
and the deep red
Lily
silk
was
dress
8
she
years
wore
old,
looked
small for her
expensive
age,
without trying to
with
announce
huge
it.
brown eyes
That was always
somehow
Victoria's
carried
style.
more empathy than most
Precision
adults
over
Daniel
decoration.
knew. People often
long, dark
described her as
curls were
beautiful
tangled
after
from
she left
sleep,
the room,
and she clutched a stuffed
while she
rabbit
was in
named
it,
Olive
they
against her
usually
chest
chose words
so
like
tightly.
intimidating. One of its ears
Councilman Avery
permanently
just
turned
arrived,
sideways, said Sarah Lynn
You're
quietly
supposed to be
beside
eating
her.
breakfast.
Sarah was Victoria's
Daniel said
executive
softly.
assistant. 30
I
years
was waiting
old,
for you.
slim, efficient,
That
and
sentence
perpetually
alone nearly
composed in the
broke
way
him.
only exhausted
He
people
looked
learn
toward
to
the
be.
clock on the microwave.
Her black hair was tied into a
7:12
low knot,
a.m.
not for fashion,
His interview
but
at Hawthorne
practicality.
Dynamics
She
started
wore
at 8
rectangular
downtown,
glasses and neutral
48
colors
minutes
every
away
day
in normal
because
weather.
she hated attention
Today,
and
with
loved
snow falling
control
sideways
almost as much
across
as Victoria
Chicago,
did.
impossible.
Unlike most employees at Hayes
His
Urban
phone
Development,
buzzed.
Sarah had
Ride
stopped trying to
canceled.
impress her boss years
Daniel
ago.
stared at the
Their
notification
relationship
for a
worked
full
because
second
neither woman
before
wasted
laughing
energy
once under
pretending
his
worth.
breath.
They didn't feel
Not
naturally.
because it was funny.
Put him at
because
table
if he
4.
didn't laugh,
Victoria
he might lose
replied.
his mind.
Away from
Bad
the
news?
press. Lily asked. Sarah
Carefully.
nodded once
He
and
hated
disappeared
how
into the
careful
crowd.
she'd become these
The
past
ballroom
2 years.
hummed with expensive
Just transportation
conversations.
stuff, bug.
Investors
He
laughed
forced
too
a smile.
loudly.
Nothing
Politicians
catastrophic
shook
yet.
hands like performers
She climbed
repeating
onto one of the
rehearsed
kitchen
scenes
stools
and studied him
Crystal
quietly
chandeliers
while he refreshed
reflected
the
across
rideshare app
polished
again
marble
and again.
floors.
While waiters
Surge
carried
pricing
trays of
flashed
wine that
across
cost
the
more
screen
than
like
most
an
Chicago
insult.
families spent on
$93
groceries
in a
for a
week.
20-minute
Victoria
ride.
scanned the room
He
automatically,
had $61
searching
in his
for
checking
problems
account
before
until
they
Friday.
existed.
She
Daniel
had spent
pressed
both
15
hands against the
years
counter and
training
closed
herself
his
to
eyes
notice
briefly
weakness
early. Divorce
Her
had
father
not
used to
ruined him
say,
all at once.
"Survival in
It had
business
happened slowly,
depended on seeing
one
cracks
legal payment
before the building
one missed
collapsed."
bill, one extra
Then again,
shift.
her
One
father
cup
had
snow
died at his
hammered
desk
against
at
the streets of
58,
Chicago
with enough
hard enough
stress
to
in his
erase the
bloodstream to
skyline
kill
beyond the
2
apartment
men.
windows.
Victoria
The city
adjusted
looked
the diamond
blurred,
bracelet around her
cold,
wrist
and exhausted,
looked toward the stage,
like everyone
where
inside
a
it was
massive
simply
digital
trying to
rendering
survive
of the
another
Meridian
winter
Center
morning.
rotated
Daniel
slowly on
Brooks
screen.
stood in the narrow
project
kitchen of
was
his
supposed to
Southside
redefine
apartment,
the Southside
staring at the
waterfront.
coffee maker like it had
Luxury
personally
apartments,
betrayed
retail
him.
space,
Its
public
sputtered
housing
once,
integration,
coughed
medical
steam,
offices,
then died
the
completely.
crown
Jewel of her company.
Perfect.
And tonight
He
was
muttered
about
under his
securing the
breath.
final wave of investment money.
Perfect timing.
A sudden disturbance near the
38,
front
Daniel
entrance
had the
pulled
kind
her
of
attention
face
away
life
from the
carved
stage
instead of
One of
shaped.
the hotel security
Sharp
guards was
jawline
blocking
hidden
someone
beneath
from entering
uneven
the
stubble.
ballroom. Tired,
Victoria
gray blue
watched
eyes
for a few
shadowed by
seconds
too
before
many sleepless
irritation
nights
settled
dark
quietly
brown
into her
hair that
chest.
curled slightly
Excuse
at the
me,
ends because he
she
never
muttered,
had time to cut
already
it properly
walking.
anymore.
The closer
He was
she got,
broad-shouldered
the more
from years
obvious
of warehouse
the contrast
labor,
became.
but exhaustion
The man
had thinned
standing
him
near the
recently,
entrance
pulling
looked like he
tension
belonged
tight
to an
across his
entirely
features.
different
People
Chicago
used
than the
to
one
describe
inside the
him as
ballroom.
intimidating
He was
before
tall,
they heard him speak.
broad-shouldered.
Then they
Probably
noticed
late
how
30s,
gentle he was
wearing
with
a dark
everyone
canvas
except
work
himself,
jacket damp from melting
especially
snow.
with his daughter.
The jacket had faded faded around the
Dad?
elbows from years of use.
A small voice called.
His jeans carried dust
Daniel
stains near
turned
the
toward the
knees,
hallway,
and his boots were
just as
heavy
Lily
construction
Brooks
boots,
shuffled
with
into
salt
the
drying
kitchen,
along the leather
wearing
seams.
oversized
He
pink
looked
socks
tired,
and a
in a
yellow
way
sweater
expensive
covered in
vacations
tiny
never
embroidered
fixed.
stars.
But what caught
Lily
Victoria's
was 8 years
attention
old,
was his
small
face,
for her age,
not
with
handsome in the
huge
polished
brown
way
eyes
magazine
that somehow
covers
carried
preferred.
more empathy than most
His jaw
adults
was
Daniel
rough,
knew.
with short,
Her
uneven
long
beard
dark
growth.
curls were
Like
tangled
shaving
from
had
sleep,
stopped
and
mattering
she clutched a
consistently.
stuffed rabbit named
There was
Olive
a thin
against
scar
her
near
chest,
his chin,
so
and
tightly,
another
one of
barely
its
visible
ears
line through one
permanently leaned
eyebrow.
sideways.
His eyes were
"You're
gray,
supposed to be eating
sharp,
breakfast,"
observant,
Daniel said
carrying
softly.
the exhausted patience
"I
of
was
someone
waiting
used
for
to
you."
disappointment.
Not
That
angry.
sentence alone nearly
Worse.
broke him.
Used to it.
He looked toward the clock
Sir?
on the microwave. The security guard said
7:12
again,
a.m.
firmer this time. His interview
This
at
is a
Hawthorne
private
Dynamics
event.
started at 8
The
downtown.
man kept his voice calm.
48 minutes away
I'm
in
not
normal
here for the
weather.
gala.
Today,
I need 5
with
minutes
snow
with
falling
whoever's overseeing
sideways
the
across
Meridian
Chicago,
housing contracts.
impossible. Victoria
His
stepped
phone buzzed.
closer. Ride
That would be me.
canceled. The
Daniel
man turned
stared
toward
at the
her.
notification
For a
brief
full
second
second, neither
before
spoke.
laughing once under his breath.
Victoria Hayes.
Not because it was funny,
she said
because
flatly.
if he didn't laugh, he might
Ethan
lose
Carter.
his mind.
Bad
His
news?
voice was low and
Lily
steady.
asked carefully.
No nervousness.
He hated how
No
careful
attempt to
she'd become
impress
these
her.
past 2 years.
I sent
Just
3
transportation
emails about
stuff,
structural
He
discrepancies
forced a
tied to
smile.
Meridian subcontractors.
Nothing catastrophic yet.
Ethan
She
continued.
climbed onto one of the kitchen
Nobody
stools
answered.
and studied him
I called
quietly
twice
while
last
he
week.
refreshed the
Same
rideshare
result.
app again and again.
So I came here.
Surge pricing
Victoria
flashed across
studied
the
him
screen like an
silently.
insult.
Everything
$93
about him
for a
disrupted the
20-minute
atmosphere
ride.
she had spent
He had
months
$61 in
constructing
his
tonight.
checking
The
account
guests
until
nearby
Friday.
had already started
Daniel
pretending
pressed
not to
both hands
stare.
against the
What
counter
exactly
and
are
closed
you
his eyes
implying?
briefly.
She
Divorce
asked.
had not
That
ruined him all
somebody's
at once.
changing
It had
approved
happened
materials
slowly.
inside the project.
One legal payment.
Victoria
one
almost
missed bill.
sighed.
One extra shift.
Construction complaints
One
were
cup of snow
constant.
hammered against the
Contractors
streets of Chicago
blamed engineers
hard enough to erase the
engineers
skyline
blamed
beyond the
procurement.
apartment windows.
Most accusations
The city
turned out
looked
to be
blurred,
money fights between
cold,
men
and
with bruised
exhausted.
egos.
Like everyone
And
inside
you
it
are?
was simply trying
She
to
asked.
survive another winter
Former
morning.
structural engineer.
Daniel Brooks stood in the
Former.
narrow kitchen of his
Interesting
Southside
word.
apartment,
Victoria
staring at the
noticed
coffee
the
maker
tiny
like it
pause
had
before he
personally
said it.
betrayed him.
Mr.
It
Carter
sputtered once,
she replied
coughed
carefully.
steam, then died
This isn't the
completely.
place for this discussion.
Perfect.
I know exactly
muttered
what
under
this
his
place
breath.
is.
Ethan
Absolutely
said.
perfect timing.
That's why I
came.
At 38,
Something
Daniel
about
had
the
the kind of
sentence
face
irritated
life
her
carved
immediately.
instead of shaped.
Not
Sharp
disrespect.
jawline hidden beneath uneven
Certainty.
stubble.
Behind
Tired,
him,
gray
snow
blue
blew
eyes
briefly
shadowed
through
by
the
too
revolving
many
hotel
sleepless
door
nights.
before
Dark
vanishing
brown
into
hair that
warmth and
curled
music.
slightly at the ends
Victoria
because he
lowered her
never had
voice.
time to cut it properly anymore.
Tonight involves
He was
city
broad-shouldered
officials,
from years of
investors,
warehouse
media
labor,
partners.
but
If you
exhaustion
have
had thinned him
documentation,
recently,
submit it
pulling
through legal
tension
channels.
tight across his
I
features.
already did.
People
Then
used
wait
to
for a
describe him as
response.
intimidating
I've been
before they
waiting
heard him
3
speak.
months.
His
Then they
eyes
noticed
stayed
how
on
gentle
hers
he
the
was with
entire
everyone
time,
except himself,
calm enough to make her uncomfortable.
especially with his daughter.
Most people either challenged
Dad?
Victoria or feared her.
A small voice
Ethan
called.
was doing neither.
Daniel
and
turned toward
somehow
the hallway.
That felt worse.
Just as Lily
She
Brooks
became aware of
shuffled into
several
the kitchen,
donors watching
wearing
nearby.
oversized pink
One of them
socks
whispered
and a
something
yellow
behind
sweater
a champagne
covered in
glass.
tiny embroidered
Victoria
stars.
made her decision
Lily
instantly.
was 8 years old.
Frank,
Small for her age,
she said
with
to the security
huge
guard.
brown eyes that
Escort
somehow
Mr. Carter
carried
out,
more
please.
empathy than most adults.
The older
Daniel
guard
knew.
hesitated.
Her long
Frank
dark
was a
curls were
thick-necked
tangled
man in
from
his
sleep,
sleep, with
and she
tired
clutched a
eyes
stuffed
and a
rabbit
retired
named
olive
Olive
against
posture.
her chest so
Ma'am.
tightly, one of its ears
Now.
permanently leaned
Ethan
sideways.
stared
at her for another second.
You're supposed to be
Not
eating
pleading,
breakfast.
not
Daniel
furious,
said softly.
just disappointed.
I was waiting for you.
All right, he
That
said
sentence
quietly.
alone nearly
He
broke
turned
him.
without resistance and
He
walked
looked
toward
toward
the
the
clock on the
exit.
microwave.
Victoria
7:12
exhaled slowly.
Annoyed
His
by the
interview
strange
at Hawthorne
flicker of guilt
Dynamics
moving
started
through
at
her
8
chest.
downtown.
Sarah reappeared
48
beside
minutes
her.
away in normal
Problem
weather.
handled? Today,
Yes.
with snow
But even
falling
as she
sideways
answered,
across
Victoria
Chicago,
kept thinking about
impossible.
the way Ethan had looked at the ballroom.
His phone buzzed.
Not impressed.
Ride canceled.
Not intimidated.
Daniel
Like he had
stared at the
already seen what
notification
happened
for a
when
full
buildings
second
failed
before
and people with
laughing
money
once
chose
under
not
his
to
breath.
listen.
Not because
20
it was
minutes
funny,
later, the
because if
first
he
engineer
didn't laugh,
started
he might
screaming
lose
near
his
the
mind.
stage.
Bad
The
news?
ballroom music stopped
Lily asked
abruptly.
carefully.
Several
He
investors
hated how
turned toward a
careful she'd
cluster
become
of
these
people
past 2
gathered around the
years.
presentation monitors.
Just transportation stuff,
Victoria
bug.
moved quickly
He
through the
forced
crowd.
a smile.
What
Nothing
happened?
catastrophic yet.
A young
She
project
climbed
engineer
onto one of
named
the kitchen
Daniel
stools
Brooks
and
stood
studied him
frozen
quietly
beside a laptop.
while he refreshed
Daniel
the
was
rideshare app
27,
again and
pale,
again.
painfully
Surge
thin,
pricing
with
flashed
nervous
across
habits
the
he tried
screen like an
unsuccessfully
insult.
to hide.
$93
Sweat
for a
darkened the collar of his
20-minute
dress
ride.
shirt.
He had
These
$61
load
in his
calculations.
checking account
He
until
stammered.
Friday. Daniel pressed
They don't
both
match the
hands
approved
against the
framework.
counter and closed his eyes briefly.
Victoria grabbed the
Divorce
tablet
had not
from his
ruined
hands.
him all at once. It
Numbers,
had happened slowly.
material codes,
one legal payment,
steel
one
classifications,
missed bill,
then
one
her
extra
stomach
shift,
tightened.
one
The
cup of
support
snow
ratings
hammered
were
against
wrong.
the streets of
Not
Chicago
slightly
hard
wrong,
enough to erase the skyline beyond the
catastrophically wrong.
apartment windows.
How long has this been
the
here?
city looked blurred,
She demanded.
cold, and
I
exhausted.
don't know.
Like everyone
Daniel
inside
whispered.
it was simply
completely
I
trying
thought it
to
was a
survive
filing
another
error
winter
until I
morning.
checked the procurement logs.
Daniel Brooks stood in the
Around
narrow
them,
kitchen of his
executives began
outside
speaking
apartment,
over one
staring
another.
at the coffee maker
What does this
like
mean?
it had personally
Can it be
betrayed
fixed?
him. It sputtered
Jesus
once,
Christ.
coughed steam,
Victoria's
then
mind
died
moved
rapidly.
rapidly.
Trying to control the
Perfect.
room before
He muttered
panic
under his
spread.
breath.
Then another voice cut
Absolutely
through the noise
perfect
behind her.
timing.
It means your
38,
load-bearing columns
Daniel
are
had the kind of
undersupported
face
by almost
life
30%
carved
instead of shaped.
Silence
Sharp
hit
jawline
instantly.
hidden beneath uneven
Victoria
stubble,
turned, tired, gray blue eyes near the ballroom entrance again. Sleepless nights. Snow still melting. Dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. Nobody had noticed him never had time to cut it properly anymore. He walked toward the screen calmly. He was broad-shouldered from years of warehouse labor. Stared at him like an intruder. Had thinned him recently. Then he pointed at the structural tight across his features. People used to describe him as intimidating before they heard him speak.
He said. Cheaper
then
material,
they noticed how gentle he was with everyone except himself.
This either didn't understand
with his
math.
daughter.
He looked directly
Dad?
at Victoria.
A small voice
or
called.
Hoped nobody else would.
Daniel turned toward the hallway.
The next morning,
just
Chicago
as Lily
looked washed
Brooks
out,
shuffled
beneath
into
low
the
gray
kitchen,
clouds,
wearing
and
oversized
snow
pink
piled along
socks
the
and a
curbs
yellow
like
sweater
forgotten
covered in
cement.
tiny embroidered
Victoria
stars.
Hayes drove south
Lily was
alone
8 years
in
old,
a black
small
Range
for her
Rover
age,
that looked
with
absurdly
huge brown
expensive
eyes that somehow
against
carried
streets
more
lined with
empathy than
cracked
most
sidewalks
adults
and
in Daniel
boarded
knew.
storefronts.
Her long
She
dark
almost turned
curls were
back
tangled
twice,
from sleep,
not because she was afraid of the neighborhood.
Rabbit named
Victoria
Olive against
did
her
not
chest
scare
so
easily.
tightly.
She had
One of
spent
its ears
15 years
permanently leaned
negotiating with men
sideways.
who smiled while trying to
supposed
ruin
to be
her.
eating breakfast.
Fear usually arrived
Daniel
wearing
said
tailored
softly.
suits, not
I was waiting
graffiti-covered
for
brick.
you.
What unsettled her was
That
simpler.
sentence alone
She had
nearly
gone home
broke
after
him.
the gala and
He
barely
looked
slept.
toward the clock on the
Every
microwave.
time she closed her eyes,
7:12
she saw Ethan
a.m.
Carter standing
His
in front of
interview
that
at Hawthorne
ballroom
Dynamics
screen,
started
while
at
half
8
the executives
downtown.
around him looked
48 minutes
completely
away
lost.
in normal weather.
The calm in his voice
Today,
bothered her
with
most.
snow falling
People usually
sideways
became
across
emotional
Chicago,
when accusing billion-dollar
impossible.
companies of corruption.
His phone buzzed.
Ethan had sounded tired,
Ride canceled.
like he had seen this before.
Daniel stared at the
The
notification
address Sarah
for a
found
full
for him
second
led to a
before
six-story
laughing
apartment
once under
building
his
near
breath.
South Halsted Street.
Not because it was funny,
The structure
because
leaned
if he
slightly
didn't
from
laugh,
age.
he
Its
might
old
lose his
red
bricks
mind,
darkened by
Bad
decades
news?
of winter soot
Lily
and
asked
neglect.
carefully.
One
He
window on the
hated how
third floor had
careful
been
she'd
patched
become
with
these
past
plywood.
2 years.
The front steps
Just
carried
transportation
salt stains
stuff,
and
bug.
cigarette burns.
He forced a
Victoria
smile.
parked across
Nothing
the street
catastrophic
and sat
yet.
inside the car for
She
almost
climbed
a minute.
onto one of the kitchen
A man
stools
wearing a
and
grocery
studied
store
him
apron
quietly
pushed a
while
cart
he
through
refreshed
slush
the
nearby.
rideshare app again.
Two teenagers
and again.
argued beside a
Surge
bus stop
pricing
while music
flashed
leaked
across
faintly
the
from
screen
someone's
like an
phone
insult.
speaker.
$93 for a
No
20-minute
cinematic
ride.
misery.
He had
No
$61
dramatic
in his
desperation.
checking account until
Just
Friday.
exhaustion
Daniel
stretched
pressed
over
both
years.
hands against the counter
Victoria
and closed
finally
his
stepped
eyes
out
briefly.
into the cold.
Divorce had
Her
not
heels
ruined him all at
immediately
once.
sank slightly
It had
into
happened
dirty
slowly.
ice.
One legal
Perfect.
payment. One missed
Inside,
bill.
the
one
hallway
extra
smelled
shift.
faintly of
One
radiator
cup
heat,
snow
old
hammered
cooking
against
oil,
the streets
and
of
wet
Chicago
concrete.
hard enough to
The
erase
elevator
the
door stood
skyline
half
beyond the
open,
apartment windows.
with a handwritten
The
out of
city
order
looked
sign
blurred,
taped crookedly
cold,
across
and
them.
exhausted.
She
Like
climbed
everyone
3
inside it
flights.
was simply trying to survive another
Apartment
winter morning.
3C.
Daniel
Victoria
Brooks
knocked
stood in
once.
the narrow kitchen
No
of his
answer.
south side apartment,
She knocked again.
staring at the
Harder
coffee
this
maker
time.
like it had
Heavy
personally
footsteps
betrayed him.
crossed the floor
It
inside before
sputtered
the
once,
door opened
coughed
halfway.
steam,
Ethan
then
Carter
died
looked
different in
completely
daylight. Without
perfect.
ballroom lighting
He
and
muttered
polished
under his
marble
breath.
behind him, the
Absolutely
roughness of his
perfect
face
timing.
became clearer. At
There were
38,
deep lines
Daniel
near
had
his
the kind
eyes
of
that
face
made him
life
seem carved
carved instead of
39.
shaped. His dark
Sharp
hair needed
jawline,
cutting, hidden beneath
thick
uneven
around the
stubble,
sides,
tired
slightly
gray
silver near
blue
the
eyes,
temples.
shadowed by
He
too
wore
many
a faded
faded charcoal
charcoal
sweater,
dark brown
pushed
hair
up
that
at the
curled
curls,
slightly at the ends
revealing
because
old
he
scars
never had
along
time
one
to cut it
wrist,
properly anymore.
construction scars.
He was broad-shouldered from
jagged and
years of
pale.
warehouse labor.
His
but
expression
exhaustion
did not
had
change
changed
much
much
when
when
he
he
saw
saw
her,
her.
pulling tension
Miss
tight
Hayes?
across his features.
Victoria is fine.
People used to
I doubt
describe him as
that.
intimidating
His voice
before
stayed
they heard
even,
him speak.
but there was dry humor
Then
buried
they noticed
underneath
how
it for the
gentle he
first
was
time.
with everyone except
Victoria
himself,
noticed a large dog
especially
standing
with
behind
his
him near
daughter.
the kitchen doorway.
Dad?
German Shepherd mix.
A small voice called.
Old. Probably
Daniel
12 or
turned
13.
toward the hallway.
Gray
Just
fur
as
spread
Lily
around the
Brooks
muzzle,
shuffled
and one
into the
ear bent
kitchen,
permanently
wearing
downward.
oversized pink socks
The
and
dog
a yellow
watched her
sweater
carefully
covered in
without
tiny
barking.
embroidered stars.
That's Walter.
Lily was
Ethan
8 years
said,
old,
after noticing
small
where
for
she
her
looked.
age, with
He only
huge
bites
brown eyes
politicians.
that somehow carried more
Victoria
empathy than most
almost
adults.
smiled
Daniel
despite
knew.
herself.
Her long dark
Almost.
curls were tangled
Can I
from
come in?
sleep, and she clutched a
Ethan
stuffed
studied her
rabbit
for
named
2
Olive against
seconds
her
before
chest,
stepping
so
aside
tightly,
silently.
one of its ears
The apartment
permanently leaned
surprised her.
sideways.
Small, yes.
You're supposed
Worn
to be
down,
eating breakfast,
but clean in the way
Daniel
places
said
become
softly.
clean when someone is trying
I
to
was
maintain
waiting for
dignity
you.
instead of appearances.
That sentence alone
Old
nearly
hardwood
broke
floors,
him. Narrow kitchen.
He looked toward
a
the clock
bookshelf
on the
prepared
microwave.
with metal brackets. 7:12
Folded
a.m.
blankets stacked neatly
His
on the
interview
couch.
at Hawthorne
Nothing
Dynamics
decorative.
started at 8
Nothing
downtown.
unnecessary.
48
Walter
minutes
limped
away in
slowly
normal
toward
weather.
Victoria.
Today,
Sniffed once
with
at her
snow
coat,
falling falling
then lost
sideways
interest
across
and returned to his
Chicago?
blanket beside the radiator.
Impossible.
He's got
His phone
arthritis.
buzzed.
Ethan
Ride
said.
canceled.
Vet says he's too stubborn
Daniel
to die.
stared at the notification
say that
for
like
a
you
full
respect
second
it.
before laughing
I do.
once under his breath.
Victoria
Not because it
removed
was
her gloves
funny,
slowly
because
while
if he
looking
didn't
around
laugh,
the apartment.
he might lose his
Framed
mind.
engineering
Bad
sketches
news?
rested near the bookshelf.
Lily asked carefully.
Bridges,
He hated
support
how
systems,
careful she'd become these past 2
structural
years.
layouts drawn
Just
by
transportation
hand.
stuff, Bug.
You did those?
He forced a smile.
She asked.
Nothing catastrophic
Ethan nodded
yet.
once and walked
She
toward the
climbed
kitchen.
onto one of the kitchen
Coffee?
stools and studied him
No.
quietly. While he refreshed
himself
the
one
rideshare
anyway.
app again and
Victoria
again.
watched the movements
Surge
carefully.
pricing flashed across
Ethan
the screen
carried
like an
himself
insult.
like someone used to physical labor,
$93 for
even
a
when doing
20-minute
small
ride.
things.
He had
Efficient,
$61 in his
economical,
checking account until
no
Friday.
wasted motion.
Daniel pressed both
You
hands
came to
against
ask
the
whether
counter
I'm
and
lying,
closed his eyes briefly.
he said, without looking
Divorce
at her.
had not ruined him all
Victoria
at once.
leaned
It
slightly
had
against the
slowly.
counter.
One legal
I came
payment,
because half
one
my
missed
executive
bill,
board
one
spent
extra
all night
shift,
pretending your
one
concerns
snow
were
hammered
exaggerated.
against the streets of Chicago
And the other
hard
half?
enough to erase the
They were
skyline
too
beyond the
scared to
apartment
speak.
windows. The
Ethan
city
drank
looked quietly
blurred,
from a chipped
cold,
mud
and
exhausted.
You know what
like
bothered
everyone
them
inside
most?
it was simply trying
Victoria
to survive
asked.
another winter morning.
Not the possibility of
Daniel
structural
Brooks
fraud.
stood in the narrow
The
kitchen
fact
of his
someone
Southside
outside
apartment,
the company
staring at the
noticed
coffee
before they
maker
did.
like it had personally
That's
betrayed
because
him.
people like your
It
executives
sputtered
only look
once,
upward.
coughed steam,
Ethan replied.
then died completely.
They never look where the damage actually
Perfect.
happens.
He muttered under his breath.
Victoria crossed her arms.
Absolutely perfect timing.
You speak like someone who
At
learned
38,
that personally.
Daniel had the kind
For
of
the
face
first
life
time
carved
since she
instead
entered
of
the
shaped.
apartment.
Ethan
Sharp
went
jawline,
still, hidden beneath
not
uneven
angry.
stubble,
Worse.
tired gray blue
Careful.
eyes shadowed by
He set the
too
mug
many
down
sleepless
slowly.
nights.
5
Dark
years
brown
ago,
hair that curled
he
slightly
said,
at the ends
I worked
because
for a
he
company
never had time
called
to cut
Meridian
it properly
Structural
anymore.
Group.
He was
Biggest
broad-shouldered
commercial
from
contractor
years of
in
warehouse
Illinois at
labor,
the time.
but exhaustion
We were building
had
a
thinned
parking
him
structure
recently,
near Cicero.
pulling tension tight across his
Victoria
features.
listened without interrupting.
People used to describe
There
him
were
as
problems with the
intimidating
support
before they heard him
calculations.
speak.
Ethan continued.
Then they noticed how
Cheap
gentle he
concrete,
was with
missing
everyone except
reinforcement
himself,
bars. I filed
especially with
reports.
his daughter.
Nobody cared.
Dad?
He paused briefly.
A small voice called.
3 months later,
Daniel
part of
turned
the
toward the
structure
hallway,
collapsed
just
during
as
heavy
Lily
snow.
Brooks shuffled
Victoria
into the
felt her
kitchen,
stomach
wearing
tighten.
oversized
How
pink
many people
socks and
died?
a yellow sweater covered
None.
in tiny embroidered
Ethan
stars.
looked out the window.
Lily was 8
But
years
6
old,
families
small
lost their
for her
apartments,
age, with
because the
huge
collapse
brown
damaged
eyes
the
that
connected
somehow carried
residential
more
building
empathy
beside
than
it.
most adults
City
Daniel
blamed
knew.
weather.
Her long
Company
dark
blamed
curls were tangled from
subcontractors.
sleep, and she
And
clutched
you?
a stuffed rabbit named
They
Olive
blamed
against
me.
her chest so
He said it
tightly
flatly.
one of its ears
No
permanently
self-pity.
leaned sideways.
That somehow made it
You're
worse.
supposed to be eating
Victoria
breakfast.
studied him
Daniel
carefully
said
now.
softly.
The scars,
I
the
was waiting for
exhaustion,
you.
the restraint.
That
A
sentence
man like
alone
this
nearly
did not
broke
become
him.
quiet naturally.
He looked toward
Something
the clock
had
on the
beaten the
microwave.
noise out of him.
7:12
You tried to
a.m.
expose them.
His interview
She
at
said
Hawthorne
softly.
Dynamics started at
I was
8
stupid
downtown.
enough to think evidence
48
mattered.
minutes away in normal
And
weather.
after that,
Today,
no
with
company
snow
would hire
falling
me.
sideways across
Ethan
Chicago,
shrugged once.
impossible.
Investors talk.
His phone
Developers talk more.
Ride canceled.
One phone call from the wrong
Daniel
executive
stared
and
at the
suddenly your name
notification
disappears.
for a full second before
Victoria
laughing
looked
once
toward the
under his
engineering
breath.
drawings again.
Not because it was funny.
You were good at
because
this.
if he didn't laugh,
I was
he might lose
excellent
his
at it.
mind. Bad
Not
news?
arrogance.
Lily asked
Fact.
carefully.
Walter
Hated how
lifted his head
careful she'd
briefly
become
as if
these past
reacting
2
to
years.
the tension in the room.
Just
before
transportation
settling
stuff,
again.
bug. He
Victoria
forced a
walked
smile.
toward the bookshelf
Nothing
slowly.
catastrophic
Her
yet.
reflection
She
faintly
climbed
crossed
onto one of the
dark
kitchen
apartment
stools
window
and
beside
studied
it.
him quietly.
For
While he
years,
refreshed
she had
the
measured
rideshare
people
app
quickly.
again and again. Competent or
Surge
useless,
pricing flashed
valuable
across the
or
screen like an
expensive,
insult.
safe or dangerous.
$93
for a
It
20-minute
suddenly
ride.
occurred to her
He had
how often she had
$61 in his
confused
checking
wealth
account
with
until
intelligence.
Friday. Daniel pressed
How
both
many
hands
others?
against the counter and
She asked
closed his eyes
quietly.
briefly.
How many
Divorce had
projects
not
like
ruined
mine?
him all at once.
Ethan looked at her directly.
One legal payment.
really want the answer?
One missed bill. One extra
Yes.
shift. One cut. Snow
More than you'd
hammered
sleep
against the
comfortably
streets
knowing.
of Chicago hard enough to erase the
room fell
skyline beyond
silent.
the apartment windows.
Outside,
The city
snow
looked
hit
blurred,
the windows in soft
cold and
bursts.
exhausted. Like
Victoria
everyone inside
realized
it was
she had
simply
stopped
trying to
thinking
survive
about
another
Ethan as
winter
an
morning.
inconvenience.
Daniel
Sometime
Brooks
during the
stood
last
in the
10
narrow
minutes.
kitchen of his Southside
Now,
apartment,
she was
staring
thinking
at the
about him as
coffee
a
maker
warning.
like it had personally betrayed him.
You still haven't
It
explained
sputtered
why you
once,
came to the gala
coughed
personally.
steam, then died
She said.
completely. Ethan leaned
Perfect.
back slightly
He
against
muttered
the counter.
under his
breath.
Absolutely
Because people are
perfect
going to
timing.
live
in Meridian.
At 38, Daniel
That's
had
not
the
an
kind
answer.
of face life carved
It is to
instead of
me.
shaped. Sharp
Victoria
jawline hidden
frowned.
beneath uneven stubble.
Ethan rubbed
tired
tiredly
gray
at the
blue
back of
eyes
his neck before
shadowed by too
continuing.
many sleepless nights.
You know
Dark
what
brown
rich
hair
people
that
never
curled
understand
slightly
about
at the
this
ends
city?
because he never
He
had time
asked
to cut
quietly.
it properly anymore. He was
What?
broad-shouldered from years
They
of
think
warehouse
owning
labor,
Chicago
but exhaustion
means
had thinned him
understanding it.
recently, pulling tension
Victoria
tight
said
across his
nothing.
features.
Because for
People
the first
used to
time in
describe him
years,
as intimidating
she
before
suspected
they heard
someone
him
was
speak.
describing her
Then they noticed
perfectly.
how gentle he was with
Below
everyone
the
except
apartment
himself.
window, a fire truck passed
Especially
through
with
the
his
street
daughter.
with its siren echoing across
Dad?
the frozen neighborhood.
A small voice called.
Ethan looked toward the sound
Daniel
automatically,
turned toward the
like
hallway,
someone trained by
just as
experience
Lily
to
Brooks
expect
shuffled
disaster
into the
before
kitchen,
calm.
wearing
Victoria
oversized
noticed
pink
that
socks
too,
and a yellow
and somewhere
sweater
deep
covered in
beneath
her
tiny
irritation.
embroidered
Something
stars.
unfamiliar
Lily
started
was 8
forming.
years old, small for her
Respect.
age.
With huge
By
brown
Monday
eyes
morning,
that
the
somehow
Meridian
carried
Project
more empathy
no
than
longer
most
felt like a
adults, Daniel
construction
knew.
deal.
It felt
Her
like
long
a
dark
body
curls were
slowly
tangled from
surfacing
sleep,
through dark
and she
water.
clutched a stuffed
Victoria
rabbit named
Hayes
Olive
stood
against her
inside the
chest,
43rd
so
floor
tightly,
conference
one of
room
its
of
ears
Hayes
permanently
Urban
leaned
Development,
sideways.
while snow drifted past the
You're
windows
supposed to be
behind
eating
her.
breakfast.
Chicago
Daniel
spread
said
beneath
softly.
the glass in steel, smoke,
waiting for
and
you.
pale winter light.
That
Normally,
sentence
the view
alone
calmed
nearly
her.
broke him.
Today, it only reminded
He
her
looked
how much
toward the
damage
clock on the
could
microwave.
be hidden from above.
7:12
Ethan sat across
a.m.
from her at the long
His
black
interview at
conference
Hawthorne
table,
Dynamics
wearing the
started
same
at
dark
8
jacket
downtown.
from the gala,
48 minutes
cleaner
away
now,
in normal
brushed
weather.
free of dust
Today,
and snow,
with
he
snow
looked
falling
deeply
sideways
out of
across
place
Chicago,
among polished marble
impossible.
floors and silent
His phone
assistants moving
buzzed.
through hallways with
Ride
tablets and
canceled.
coffee trays. And
Daniel
somehow,
stared at the
that
notification
made everyone
for a
else in the
full
building
second
look artificial
before
laughing
instead.
once under his
Stacks
breath.
of reports
Not
covered
because
the
it was
table
funny,
between them.
because if
Material
he didn't
invoices,
laugh,
he might lose
structural
his mind.
diagrams,
Bad
fire
news?
safety certifications.
Lily asked carefully.
All wrong.
He hated how careful
Sarah
she'd
Lynn
become these
stood near
past
the
2
monitor
years.
screen, arms
Just
folded
transportation
tightly
stuff,
against a gray
bug.
blazer.
He forced
Even
a smile.
she looked unsettled
Nothing
now.
catastrophic yet.
Her calm usually
She
survived
climbed onto one of
everything
the
short of
kitchen
lawsuits
stools
and
studied
studied
him
him quietly.
We checked
while he
the
refreshed
West
the
residential
rideshare
app
first,
again and again,
she said quietly.
Surge pricing
Then the
flashed
underground
across
parking
the screen
structure.
like an insult.
Ethan slid another folder
$93
across
for
the
a
table toward
20-minute
Victoria.
ride.
Every
He had
load-bearing
$61
section
in
uses
his checking
downgraded
account
steel.
until Friday.
Victoria
Daniel
opened
pressed
both
both
hands against the counter
photos,
and closed his eyes
serial
briefly.
codes,
Divorce
procurement
had not ruined
signatures.
him all at once.
The numbers
It
matched,
had happened slowly,
which meant the fraud
one legal
wasn't
payment,
random.
one missed
It was
bill,
organized.
one extra shift.
How much money?
One cup. Snow
She
hammered
asked.
against the streets
Ethan
of
leaned back
Chicago
slightly
hard
in his
enough
chair.
to erase the
Just from
skyline
the
beyond the
structural
apartment windows.
substitutions,
The city
probably
looked
6 to 8
blurred,
million.
cold, and exhausted.
Sarah inhaled
like everyone
softly.
inside it was simply
Victoria
trying to
stared
survive
at the
another
page
winter
without
morning.
moving.
Daniel
the fire
Brooks stood in the
systems?
narrow kitchen of
Cheap
his
valve
Southside
assemblies
apartment,
imported through
staring
shell
at the
suppliers.
coffee maker like it had
Ethan tapped
personally
another
betrayed him.
photograph.
Half
It
these
sputtered
sprinklers
once,
would fail under
coughed
real
steam,
pressure, then died
Victoria
completely.
looked up sharply.
Perfect.
People
He
could
muttered
die.
under his breath. That's usually
Absolutely
how unsafe
perfect
buildings
timing.
work. At 38,
tone remained
Daniel had the
flat,
kind of
but she
face life
noticed something
carved
underneath
instead of
it now.
shaped.
Not
Sharp
anger
jawline,
exactly,
hidden beneath uneven
fatigue.
stubble, tired
Like he was
gray blue
tired of
eyes shadowed
explaining
by too many
consequences.
sleepless
Wealthy
nights.
people only
Dark
respected
brown
after
hair that curled
funerals.
slightly at the,
The
ends
conference room
because
doors
he never
opened
had time to
suddenly.
cut it properly
Leonard
anymore.
Brooks walked
he was
in without
broad-shouldered
knocking.
from years of
The
warehouse
atmosphere
labor,
changed
but
instantly.
exhaustion had thinned him
Leonard
recently,
was 68
pulling
years
tension
old,
tight across
tall
his features.
despite age, beginning
People
to bend
used to
slightly
describe
at his
him as
shoulders.
intimidating
His
before
silver
they
hair
heard him
stayed
speak.
perfectly trimmed.
Then they
His
noticed how
charcoal suit
gentle he was
perfectly
with
fitted.
everyone except
He
himself.
had the kind of face
especially
expensive men
with his
developed
daughter.
over time.
Controlled
Dad?
expressions,
A small voice
expensive
called.
dental work. Daniel
Eyes that
turned toward
smiled
the hallway
half a second later
just
than his
as
mouth.
Lily Brooks
People
shuffled
trusted
into
Leonard
the kitchen,
quickly.
wearing
That was
oversized
part of the
pink
problem.
socks, and
He
a
had
yellow
mentored
sweater covered
Victoria
him
after her
tiny
father
embroidered
died,
stars.
guided her through
Lily
investor
was 8
wars,
years old, city
small for her
negotiations,
age,
media
with
scandals,
huge brown eyes
For
that
years,
somehow
she
carried
had viewed
more
him
empathy
almost as
than most
family.
adults Daniel knew.
Now she looked
Her
at
long,
him and
dark
noticed how
curls were
carefully
tangled
he
from
observed the
sleep,
folders
and
on
she
the table
clutched a
before
stuffed
speaking.
rabbit named Olive
That
against her
sounds serious.
chest.
So tightly,
Leonard said
one of
calmly.
its ears permanently
Victoria
leaned
watched
sideways.
him take off leather gloves with
supposed to be
deliberate
eating
precision.
breakfast. No
Daniel
surprise,
said softly.
no confusion.
I was
Just
waiting
calculation.
For you.
That
knew?
sentence alone nearly
She asked
broke
quietly.
Him.
Leonard
Leonard
smiled
smiled clock on the
faintly.
microwave.
Victoria.
7:12
In our industry,
a.m.
there are always
His
adjustments.
interview at Hawthorne Dynamics
Ethan's
started
eyes
at
narrowed
8 downtown.
slightly.
48 minutes away
Adjustments.
in normal weather.
Victoria repeated.
Today, with
Leonard
snow falling
walked toward the
sideways
window
across
slowly,
Chicago,
hands in his pockets.
impossible.
Do you know why
His
most
phone
development
buzzed.
projects fail?
Ride canceled.
He asked.
Because
Daniel stared
idealists
at the
confuse
notification
blueprints
for a full
with
second
reality before laughing
You
once under his
replaced
breath.
structural materials.
Not because it was funny,
Ethan
because
said
if he
coldly.
didn't laugh, he might
Leonard
lose his
glanced
mind.
at him briefly.
Bad news?
Dismissively. Lily asked
And
carefully.
you are
He hated how
someone who
careful
can
she'd
read
become these
engineering
past 2
reports.
years.
Just
Sarah
transportation
stepped
stuff,
back
bug.
slightly from the tension
forced a
building in the
smile.
room.
Nothing catastrophic
Leonard returned
yet.
his attention to
She
Victoria.
climbed onto one of the kitchen
These
stools
substitutions
and studied
were
him
approved
quietly
internally to
while he
keep Meridian
refreshed
alive.
the rideshare app
Costs
again
increased.
and again.
Investors
Surge
panicked.
pricing flashed across the
We
screen
adapted.
like an insult.
You committed fraud.
$93 for a
No.
20-minute ride.
Leonard
He had
corrected calmly.
$61 in
I
his
protected
checking
the
account until
project.
Friday. day.
Victoria
Daniel
stood
pressed both
slowly
hands
now.
against the counter and
You
closed
forged
his eyes
inspection
briefly.
approvals.
Divorce had not
Everyone
ruined him
signed
all
off.
at once. It had happened
That
slowly.
sentence landed
One
harder
legal
than she
payment,
expected.
one missed bill,
Everyone.
one extra shift,
Not one corrupt
corrupt
manager,
hammered against
not
the
one
streets
dishonest
of Chicago hard
supplier.
enough to erase the skyline beyond the
system.
apartment windows.
Leonard
The
sighed
city looked
lightly,
blurred,
like a teacher
cold, and
disappointed in a
exhausted.
student.
Like everyone inside it was
Victoria,
simply trying
you're
to
smart
survive
enough
another
to
winter
understand
morning.
this industry doesn't
Daniel
survive
Brooks
on
stood in
morality.
the narrow kitchen
It
of his
survives
Southside
on
apartment,
momentum.
staring at the coffee
Ethan
maker
laughed
like it
once
had
under his
personally
breath.
betrayed him.
Not amusement.
It sputtered
Disgust.
once, coughed
Leonard
steam,
finally looked
then
directly
died
at him.
completely. You seem familiar.
Perfect.
He
I
muttered
testified
under his
against
breath.
Meridian Structural Group 5 years ago.
Perfect timing.
Recognition flickered briefly
Daniel
in
had the
Leonard's
kind of
eyes.
face life
Carved
tiny,
instead of
but
shaped.
real.
Sharp jawline
Ethan
hidden
Carter,
beneath uneven stubble.
Leonard said.
Tired
Right,
gray blue
the
eyes
engineer.
shadowed by too many
The one your
sleepless
friends
nights.
buried.
Dark brown
Leonard
hair that
shrugged
curled
slightly.
slightly at the ends because
You
he
destroyed
never
your
had
own
time
career
to cut
by
it properly
refusing
anymore.
compromise.
He was broad-shouldered
Victoria
from years
looked
of warehouse
between them
labor,
slowly.
but exhaustion
Something
had thinned him
cold
recently,
began moving
pulling
through her
tension
chest.
tight across his features.
How connected
People
are you
used
to
to
this?
describe him as
She asked
intimidating
Leonard.
before they
His
heard him
silence
speak. Answered first.
Then they noticed
Then,
how gentle he
enough
was
to know
with
you should
everyone
stop
except
digging.
himself.
The room
Especially
became
with his
very
daughter.
Still.
Dad?
Victoria realized
A
Sarah
small
had
voice
stopped
called.
typing entirely.
Daniel turned
Leonard
toward the
adjusted
hallway.
his cufflinks
Just
before
as Lily
speaking
Brooks
again.
shuffled into
You
the
built
kitchen,
this company
wearing
because your father
oversized
understood
pink
practical
socks and
decisions.
a yellow sweater covered in
Victoria's
tiny embroidered
face hardened
stars.
instantly.
Lily was 8
My
years old.
father would
small
never
for her
approve
age,
this.
with huge
For the
brown
first
eyes
time,
that somehow
Leonard
carried
hesitated.
more empathy than most
Tiny,
adults Daniel
almost
knew.
invisible.
Her long
Ethan
dark
noticed
curls
it
were
too.
tangled from sleep.
Victoria
and she
saw the
clutched a
shift
stuffed
in both
rabbit
men
named
at the
Olive
same
against
moment.
her chest so
What?
tightly one
She
of its
asked
ears
sharply.
permanently leaned sideways.
Leonard looked away first.
You're
And
supposed
that
to be eating
terrified
breakfast.
her more than if he had shouted. Daniel said softly. 20 minutes later,
was waiting for
Victoria
you.
stood inside the private archive room
sentence
beneath
alone
executive
nearly broke
offices,
him.
while Sarah
He looked
unlocked
toward the
old
clock on the
company
microwave.
storage files.
7:12
Dust
a.m.
floated through dim
His
yellow light
interview at
overhead.
Hawthorne Dynamics
You
started
really
at
think your
8
father
downtown.
knew? 48
Sarah
minutes
asked
away
carefully.
in normal weather. Victoria
Today,
didn't answer
with
immediately.
snow falling sideways across
Her
Chicago,
father, Richard Hayes,
impossible.
had spent 30 years building
His
the
phone
company
buzzed.
before dying
Ride
from a heart attack
canceled.
inside his office.
Daniel
She
stared at the
remembered him as
notification for a
disciplined,
full
impossible
second
to
before
impress,
laughing once
emotionally
under his breath.
distant in ways
Not
that
because it
once
was
felt
funny,
normal.
because if he didn't
Now
laugh,
she wondered how
he
much
might
of that
lose his
distance
mind.
had been exhaustion.
Bad news?
Lily
Sarah
asked
finally
carefully.
found the box.
He hated how
R.H.
careful she'd become these
Private
past 2
review
years.
files.
Just transportation
Victoria
stuff,
opened it
bug.
herself.
He forced
Inside
a smile.
sat financial
Nothing
records,
catastrophic
engineering
yet.
reports,
She climbed
and
onto one of the
notes
kitchen
clipped
stools
together
and
with
studied
stated
him
markers.
quietly, while he
Her
refreshed
pulse
the
slowed
rideshare app
dangerously,
again and
then
again.
stopped
Surge
entirely.
pricing flashed
One
across
document
the screen like
carried
an
her father's
insult.
signature
beside a
$93
paragraph she
for a
read 3
20-minute
times
ride
before
he
fully
had
understanding.
$61 in his checking account
Unauthorized
until
material
Friday.
substitutions
Daniel pressed
linked
both
to
hands
Leonard
against
Brooks.
the counter and
Internal
closed his eyes
investigation
briefly.
blocked by
Divorce
board
had
majority.
not ruined him all at once.
Victoria
It
sat
had
down
happened
slowly. One
The
legal
room
payment
suddenly felt too
one missed
small.
bill, one extra
Another
shift.
note beneath it carried
One
a
cut
date
snow
only
hammered
4
against
months
the streets
before
of
her father
Chicago
died.
hard enough to erase
If
the
this
skyline
continues,
beyond the apartment
Meridian-style
windows.
failures will
The
happen
city
again.
looked blurred,
They
cold,
will
and
bury
exhausted.
anyone who
like
pushes
everyone
too
inside
hard.
it was simply trying
Victoria
to survive
stared at
another
the
winter
handwriting.
morning.
Her
Daniel
father's
Brooks
handwriting
stood in the narrow kitchen of
Neat,
his South Side
controlled,
apartment, staring at the coffee
afraid.
maker like it had
She had never
personally
seen
betrayed
fear in
him.
anything he
It
wrote
sputtered
before.
once, coughed
Sarah looked
steam,
pale now.
then died completely.
Victoria,
Perfect.
he
He
knew.
muttered under his breath.
Her voice barely
Absolutely
sounded human.
perfect timing.
He tried
At
to
38,
stop it.
Daniel had the kind of
And they
face life
silenced
carved
him.
instead of shaped. The
Sharp
realization hit
jawline
harder
hidden
than
beneath
beneath uneven stubble,
because grief was
tired
clean.
gray blue eyes
This
shadowed
was
by
rot.
too many sleepless nights.
Every promotion,
dark brown hair
every
that curled
investor
slightly
dinner,
at the ends
every
because
award,
he never had time
every
to cut it
speech about
properly
rebuilding
anymore.
Chicago.
He was
All
broad-shouldered from
standing on
years of warehouse
foundations
labor,
she never
but exhaustion
questioned.
had thinned him recently.
phone suddenly
pulling tension
vibrated.
tight across his features.
Board emergency
People
meeting.
used to describe him as
Tonight,
intimidating
7 p.m.
before they heard him speak. Sarah read the message over
Then
her
they
shoulder
noticed
and
how
went
gentle
quiet.
he was with everyone
Victoria
except himself.
already knew what it meant,
especially with
the
his
board
daughter.
had chosen a side,
Dad,
and it was not
a small voice
hers.
called. Daniel
Ethan
turned
stood
toward
silently
the hallway
near the archive
just
doorway
as Lily
while she
Brooks
closed the
shuffled
file
into
box
the
with
kitchen,
trembling
wearing
fingers. Oversized pink socks
happens
and a
now?
yellow sweater covered in
Sarah
tiny
asked
embroidered
softly.
stars.
Lily
Victoria
was
looked
8
at her
years old,
father's signature
small for
one
her
last
age,
time,
with huge
then at
brown
Leonard's
eyes
name
that
beneath
somehow
it.
carried more empathy
For
than
years,
most adults
she had believed
Daniel knew.
power meant control.
Her long dark
Now
curls
she
were
understood
tangled
something
from
worse.
sleep,
And she
Sometimes
clutched a stuffed
power
rabbit
only meant
named
being the
Olive
last
against her
person
chest
lied to.
so tightly, one
Rain
of its
fell
ears
across
permanently
Chicago in
leaned
thin
sideways.
gray
sheets the night the
You're
board
supposed
voted
to be eating
against
breakfast.
Victoria Hayes. Daniel said
The
softly.
city outside
her office windows
I
looked
was waiting
blurred
for
and
you.
distant, as if someone
That
had dragged
sentence
cold
alone
water
nearly
across the
broke him.
skyline. He looked
Victoria
toward the
sat
clock on
alone
the
at the
microwave
conference table
long after
7:12
everyone else had
a.m.
left. His
The
interview at
emergency
Hawthorne
meeting had
Dynamics
blast started at 8 downtown.
Hours. 48
3
minutes
hours
away in normal weather.
Threats
Today,
as
with
concern.
snow falling sideways
Leonard
across
Brooks
Chicago,
raised his voice once.
impossible. That was what
His
made him
phone
dangerous.
buzzed.
Men
Ride
who lost
canceled.
control were predictable.
Daniel
Leonard
stared at the
never lost
notification for
control.
a full second
Even when
before
accused of
laughing
fraud
once
involving
under his
millions
breath.
of dollars,
Not
he
because it
spoke
was
calmly,
funny,
because if he
almost
didn't
kindly,
laugh, he
like
might
a
lose his
doctor
mind.
explaining unpleasant
Bad
test
news?
results. Lily asked
You're
carefully.
emotional right now.
He hated how
He had
careful
told
she'd
her in
become
front of the
these
board.
past 2 years.
That makes people
Just
reckless.
transportation stuff, Bug.
Victoria
He
still
forced a
remembered
smile.
the silence that
Nothing
followed.
catastrophic yet.
Nobody defended
She
her.
climbed onto one of the
Not
kitchen
one
stools
person.
and studied him quietly
12
while he
executives
refreshed the
in
rideshare
tailored
app
suits
again
had
and
sat
again.
beneath recessed
Surge
lighting
pricing
while discussing
flashed across the
structural
screen like
fraud
an
like it was an
insult.
inconvenient
$93
accounting
for a
issue
20-minute
instead of something
ride.
that could kill
He had
people.
$61
She
in his
understood
checking
something
account
during that
until
meeting
Friday.
that she probably
Daniel
should have
pressed
learned
both
years
hands
ago.
against the counter
Most
and
powerful
closed his eyes
people
briefly.
were not evil.
Divorce had
Just
not ruined him all at
comfortable.
once, and
It had
comfort
happened
made
slowly.
cowards out of
One
almost
legal payment.
everyone. One missed bill.
Her office door
one
opened
extra
quietly.
shift. One
Sarah
cup
stepped
snow
inside
hammered
carrying
against
two
the
coffees.
streets of Chicago
Her
hard
dark
enough to
hair had
erase
partly
the
fallen
skyline
loose
beyond
from
the
the
apartment
apartment
windows.
windows.
For the first time Victoria
The city
could
looked
remember.
blurred,
She looked
cold, and exhausted. Like
They
everyone
finally
inside
left.
it was simply trying
Sarah
to
said
survive another
softly.
winter morning.
Victoria did
Daniel
not touch
Brooks
the coffee.
stood in the narrow kitchen of
How
his
bad?
South Side apartment,
The board
staring at
wants
the
you to
coffee
sign a
maker
compliance
like it had
resolution
personally
tomorrow
betrayed
morning.
him.
Victoria
sputtered
laughed
once
without
coughed
humor.
steam,
Of
then
course
died
they do.
completely.
Sarah placed
Perfect.
a folder on the table
He
carefully.
muttered under his breath.
If you sign
Absolutely
it, the internal
perfect
investigation
timing.
disappears.
At
Leonard
38,
keeps his
Daniel
position.
had the kind of face life
The
carved
media
instead
never
of
hears
shaped.
about the material
Sharp jawline,
substitutions.
hidden beneath uneven
And in
stubble,
exchange,
tired gray blue
you stay
eyes
CEO.
shadowed by too many sleepless
There it
nights.
was.
Dark
The
brown
deal.
hair that curled
Simple,
slightly at the
clean,
ends because he never
corrupt.
had time to cut it properly anymore.
Victoria leaned
He was
back
broad-shouldered
slowly in
from
her
years
chair
of warehouse
and
labor,
stared at the city
but
lights
exhaustion
beyond
had
the
thinned
glass.
him recently,
For
pulling
years,
tension
she
tight
had
across his
imagined losing
features.
the company would
People
feel like
used to
death.
describe him as
Now
intimidating
she wasn't sure what
before they
frightened
heard
her
him
more.
speak. Losing it?
Then they noticed
Or
how gentle
staying.
he was with everyone
Sarah
except
watched
himself,
her carefully.
especially with
You
his
don't
daughter.
have to decide tonight.
Dad?
Yes,
A small voice called.
Victoria said quietly.
Daniel turned toward the hallway.
I do.
Just as Lily Brooks
An hour
shuffled
later,
into the
she
kitchen,
found herself
wearing
driving south
oversized
through
pink
freezing
socks
rain
and a yellow
toward
sweater
Southside
covered
again.
in tiny embroidered
She did
stars.
not call Ethan first.
Lily was 8
She
years
wasn't
old,
even sure why
small
she was
for
going.
her age, with
Maybe
huge
because there
brown
were very
eyes
few
that
people
somehow
left
carried
around her
more
who
empathy
spoke
than most
honestly.
adults Daniel
Walter
knew.
barked once
Her
when she
long
knocked
dark
this
curls
time,
were tangled
deep
from
and
sleep,
hoarse with
and she
age.
clutched a stuffed
Ethan
rabbit
opened the
named
door,
Olive
wearing a
against her
dark
chest
thermal shirt
so
and
tightly,
faded jeans.
one of its ears
His hair
permanently
looked
leaned
damp,
sideways.
like he had just showered after
You're
work.
supposed to be
There
eating
was
breakfast.
grease on one hand from
Daniel
repairing
said
something
softly.
mechanical. I was
You
waiting
look
for
terrible,
you.
he said
That
immediately.
sentence alone
Good
nearly
evening to you
broke
too.
him.
He stepped
He
aside
looked toward
silently.
the clock on the microwave.
The apartment smelled faintly of
7:12
coffee and
a.m.
soldered metal.
His interview
An
at
old
Hawthorne
jazz record
Dynamics
played
started
quietly
at
from
8
somewhere
downtown.
near the kitchen.
48
Victoria
minutes
noticed
away in
blueprints
normal
spread
weather.
across the table.
Today,
Besides
with
several
snow
open
falling
inspection
sideways
reports.
across Chicago,
Ethan had been working.
Impossible.
Board meeting?
His phone buzzed.
He guessed.
Ride
Yes.
canceled.
And
Daniel
they offered
stared at
me
the
a choice.
notification for a full
Ethan
second
leaned against
before
the
laughing
counter with
once
crossed
under his
arms.
breath. Not
That
because it
usually
was
means
funny,
it isn't actually
because
a
if he didn't
choice.
laugh, he might lose
Victoria
his mind.
looked at him for a moment
news?
before speaking.
Lily asked carefully.
If I sign the
He
resolution,
hated how careful
the
she'd
investigation
become these past 2
disappears.
years.
Just
And you keep
transportation
your company.
stuff, Bug. Yes.
He forced a smile. Ethan
Nothing
nodded once
catastrophic
slowly.
yet.
Unsurprised.
She climbed onto one of the kitchen
Walter limped
stools
over and
studied
rested
him
beside
quietly
Victoria's
while he
chair with a
refreshed
tired
the
groan.
rideshare app again
She
and again.
absent-mindedly touched
Surge
the old
pricing
dog's fur
flashed
while
across
staring
the
at the
screen
rain
like
like
an
an
insult.
window.
$93
You know what the worst
for a
part is?
20-minute ride,
She asked
he
quietly.
had $61 in his
5
checking
years
account
ago,
until
I
Friday.
probably
would have signed it
Daniel
without
pressed
hesitation.
both hands against the counter
Ethan
and
said
closed
nothing.
his eyes briefly.
That company
Divorce
is
had
my
not ruined
entire
him all at
life.
once, she
It
continued.
had happened slowly.
Everything
One
I
legal
built came
payment
from there.
One missed bill.
One
No.
extra shift, Ethan said
One
calmly.
snow hammered against
Everything
the
you
streets of Chicago
sacrificed
hard enough
came
to
from
erase
there.
the skyline beyond the
sentence
apartment
landed
windows.
hard. The city
Victoria
looked blurred,
looked away
cold,
immediately
and exhausted
because he
like
was
everyone
right.
inside it was
She
simply
thought about
trying to
birthdays
survive
missed
another
for
winter
investor
morning.
dinners.
Daniel
Daniel
Brooks
Brooks
stood in
reduced
the
to
narrow
scheduling
kitchen of his
conflicts.
Southside apartment,
The penthouse
staring at
apartment
the
she
coffee
barely
maker
lived
like it
inside.
had
The
personally
way people
betrayed
spoke
him.
carefully
It
around her
sputtered
because
once,
nobody trusted
coughed powerful
steam
women to
then
remain
died
human for
completely.
long.
When my father died,
he muttered under his
she
breath
said quietly,
absolutely
I took over the company
timing.
6 weeks later.
At 38, Daniel had
Ethan
the kind of
listened
face
silently.
life carved instead of shaped.
I remember standing
Sharp
in his office
jawline
after
hidden
the
beneath
funeral,
uneven
while investors
stubble,
argued
tired
outside the
gray
door
blue
about whether I
eyes
was
shadowed
too young
by
to
too
lead.
many sleepless nights.
She laughed
Dark brown
faintly.
hair that curled slightly
One
at
of
the
them
ends
actually
because
said
he
I looked
never had
too
time to cut it
soft.
properly anymore.
You don't
he was
anymore.
broad-shouldered from years of
No.
warehouse labor. But
Victoria
exhaustion had
stared at
thinned
her
him
hands.
recently, pulling tension
I
tight
fixed
across
that.
his features.
Rain
People
tapped
used to
softly
describe
against
him
the
as
windows.
intimidating before they
Ethan
heard
walked
him
toward
speak.
the kitchen and returned with
Then
coffee
they noticed
anyway.
how gentle he
despite
was
her
with
refusing
everyone
earlier.
except himself.
You know what happens
especially
if
with
you
his
expose
daughter.
this publicly?
Dad?
He asked.
A small voice called.
Yes?
Daniel
Your
turned
stock
toward the
crashes.
hallway. Just as Lily
Yes?
Brooks shuffled
You
into
lose
the
the
kitchen,
board.
wearing oversized
Yes?
pink socks and a
You
yellow
probably
sweater
lose half
covered
your
in
investors,
tiny
too.
embroidered stars.
Victoria
Lily
nodded.
was 8 years old,
And
small
Leonard?
for her age, with
He
huge
sues me.
brown eyes that somehow carried
Probably.
more empathy than most
Walter
adults
shifted
Daniel
beside
knew.
her feet, while
Her
Ethan
long
sat
dark
across from
curls
her.
were tangled from sleep.
For a while, neither
and she
spoke.
clutched a stuffed rabbit named
Ethan
Olive
asked
against
quietly,
her chest so tightly
If people
one
move
of its
into
ears
Meridian
permanently
knowing the
leaned
structure's
sideways.
compromised,
You're
Are you going to be
sleep
eating
at night?
breakfast?
Daniel
Victoria's
said softly.
jaw tightened.
I was waiting
Because
for
that
you.
was the real question.
That sentence
Not
alone
money,
nearly broke
not
him.
reputation, not
He
power.
looked toward the clock on the microwave.
Sleep.
7:12
Conscience.
a.m. His
The things
interview
rich
at
people
Hawthorne
spend
Dynamics
fortunes
started at
trying to
8
silence
downtown, once they
48
48 minutes
understood
away
they
in normal
existed.
weather. The next
Today,
3
with
days,
snow
changed
falling
her more than the
sideways across
previous
Chicago?
15 years had.
Impossible.
Instead of
His
investor
phone
lunches,
buzzed.
Victoria
Ride
visited housing
canceled.
blocks connected to Hayes
Daniel
Urban Development
stared at the
projects.
notification for
Ethan
a
came
full
with her
second
sometimes,
before laughing
not as a
once under
guide,
his breath.
as a witness.
Not because it was funny.
She walked
because
through
if he
apartments
didn't laugh,
with cracked
he might
ceilings
lose
hidden
his
behind
mind.
fresh paint.
Bad news?
Met an elderly woman
Lily
named
asked
Mrs.
carefully.
Alvarez, who
He
lived beside
hated
a
how
leaking
careful she'd
support wall
become these
maintenance
past
teams
2
had ignored
years.
for 11
Just
months.
transportation stuff,
Mrs.
bug.
Alvarez was
He
tiny,
forced a
nearly
smile.
80,
Nothing
with
catastrophic
silver hair
yet.
braided tightly
She
down her
climbed
back,
onto one of the
and
kitchen
hands
stools
permanently
and
studied
begged
him
him
quietly,
quietly,
while he
She
refreshed
still
the
apologized
rideshare
for the
app
condition
again
of her
and
apartment
again
before letting them
Surge
inside.
pricing flashed
Victoria
across the
hated
screen
herself
like
a
an
little for
insult.
noticing how instinctive that
$93
apology
for a
sounded.
20-minute
In another
ride.
neighborhood,
He had
she met
$61
families
in his
displaced by
checking
community
account until
redevelopment
Friday.
plans.
That
Daniel
had
pressed
tripled
both
rent
hands
prices
against
within
within
2
2
years.
closed his eyes
She
briefly.
began recognizing the
Divorce
language
had
her
not
industry
ruined him all at
used.
once.
Revitalization,
slowly.
urban
One
renewal,
legal payment,
economic
one missed
modernization,
bill, one extra
beautiful
shift,
phrases
one
hiding
snow
ugly
hammered
math.
against the streets of
By
Chicago
Thursday
hard
morning,
enough to
she
erase
had
the
made her
skyline
decision.
beyond the
The
apartment
press
windows.
conference room
The
downtown
city
smelled
looked
like
blurred,
blurred wool
cold,
coats
and
camera
exhausted.
equipment
Like
overheating
everyone
under
inside
lights.
it was simply trying to
Reporters
survive
filled
another winter
nearly
morning.
every chair.
Daniel
Sarah
Brooks
stood near
stood
the
in
back
the narrow
wall,
kitchen
looking
of his
pale.
Southside apartment,
Ethan remained
staring
beside
beside
one
one
of
of
the
the
side
side
exits
like it had
with his
personally
arms folded
betrayed him.
tightly. It
Watching
sputtered
the room
once,
the way soldiers
coughed
probably
steam,
watched open
then
streets.
died completely.
Victoria stepped toward the
Perfect.
podium, wearing a
He
dark
muttered
red
under his
suit
breath.
instead of black.
Absolutely
Not armor
perfect
this time.
timing.
A warning.
At 38,
Daniel
the
had the
microphones
kind of
lit
face
up
life
instantly.
carved instead of
She
shaped.
placed a thick stack
Sharp
of documents on
jawline
the
hidden
podium,
beneath uneven
then
stubble,
looked directly into the
tired
cameras.
gray blue eyes.
My
shadowed
name
by
is
too
Victoria
many sleepless
Hayes.
nights. She said
Dark brown
calmly.
hair that curled
And my
slightly at
company
the
has
ends
been hiding
because he
structural
never had time
fraud
to cut it
tied
properly
to the
anymore.
Meridian project.
He was broad-shouldered from
The
years
room
of warehouse
exploded
labor,
immediately.
but exhaustion had thinned him
Questions,
recently,
shouting,
pulling
flashes,
tension tight across his
but
features.
Victoria kept talking.
People used to describe him as
somewhere across
intimidating
Chicago,
before they heard
she
him
knew
speak.
Leonard Brooks was
Then they
finally
noticed how
realizing
gentle he was
she
with
had
everyone
stopped
except
being
himself.
manageable, especially
By
with his
market
daughter.
close that afternoon, Hayes
Dad?
Urban Development
A
stock
small
had
voice called.
collapsed 22%.
Daniel turned toward the hallway.
At 6:30,
Just
the
as
board
Lily
officially
Brooks
removed her
shuffled
as
into the
CEO.
kitchen.
At
Wearing
8:15,
oversized pink
Leonard
socks
filed
and
a
a yellow
lawsuit
sweater covered in
accusing her of
tiny
corporate
embroidered
sabotage
stars.
and defamation.
Lily was 8 years
By
old,
midnight,
small for
Victoria
her age,
Hayes had lost
with
almost
huge brown
everything
eyes
she once
that
believed
somehow carried
mattered.
more empathy
And for
than
the
most
first
adults
time in
Daniel
years,
knew.
She
Her
slept
long
without
dark curls were
medication.
tangled from sleep.
By February,
and she clutched
Chicago
a stuffed
had
rabbit
stopped
named
talking
Olive
about
against
Victoria
her chest
Hayes with
so
sympathy
tightly,
and
one of
started
its ears
talking about her with
permanently leaned
distance.
sideways.
Scandals aged
supposed
quickly
to
in
be
the
eating
city.
breakfast.
1 month you were
Daniel
on
said
magazine
softly.
covers. 3 months
I was
later,
waiting for
people
you.
spoke about you like weather that had already
sentence
passed.
alone nearly broke
Federal
him.
investigators had
He looked
officially
toward the
opened
clock on the
inquiries into
microwave.
Leonard Brooks and several
7:12
senior
a.m.
contractors tied
His
to the
interview
Meridian
at Hawthorne
project.
Dynamics started
Construction
at 8
permits across
downtown.
3 developments
48
were
minutes
frozen.
away in normal
Engineers
weather.
who had stayed silent
Today,
for years
with snow
suddenly
falling
began
sideways
cooperating
across
once
Chicago?
subpoenas appeared.
Impossible.
Nobody called them brave.
His phone
Not
buzzed.
really.
Most of them were
Ride
just trying to
canceled.
survive.
Daniel
Victoria
stared at the
understood that now
notification
better
for
than
a
she
full
used to.
second
The
before
old
laughing
Hayes Urban
once
Development
under his
headquarters
breath.
still
Not
stood
because
over
it was
downtown
funny,
Chicago.
because if he didn't
exactly
laugh,
as before,
he might lose
all
his mind.
polished glass
Bad
and
news?
expensive silence.
Lily asked
but her
carefully.
name had already
He
disappeared
hated
from
how
the
careful
executive
she'd
floor directory.
Past 2 years.
Investors moved on
Just
quickly.
transportation stuff.
Board
bug.
members faster.
He forced a smile.
For the first
Nothing
few weeks after her
catastrophic yet.
removal, Victoria
She climbed
stayed
onto
inside
one of
her
her kitchen
penthouse
stools
almost
and studied him
constantly,
quietly,
not grieving
while he
the company
refreshed the
exactly,
rideshare app
more
again
like
and
adjusting
again.
to the absence
Surge
of noise.
pricing flashed
No
across the
assistance,
screen like
no
an insult.
interviews,
$93 from investors
pretending
emergencies were strategy.
He had $61 in his
felt
checking
unnatural
account
until
until
Friday.
Then addictive.
Daniel pressed both hands
One
against
snowy
the counter
morning,
and
she
closed
stood
his
barefoot
eyes in her
briefly.
kitchen,
Wearing
wearing
an
an oversized
oversized
gray
gray
sweater
sweater
while watching
it had
steam
happened
rise
slowly.
from coffee.
One
She
legal
finally
payment.
had time to
One
drink
missed
before
bill.
it went cold.
One extra
Her phone
shift.
barely rang
One
anymore.
snow hammered
Oddly
against
enough,
the
that
streets
hurt
of
less
Chicago
than she
hard enough to
expected.
erase the
A knock came
skyline
at the door
beyond the
around
apartment
9.
windows.
Ethan stood
The city
outside
looked
holding a
blurred,
cardboard tray with
cold,
2
and
coffees.
exhausted.
And
Like
snow
everyone
gathered
inside it
along the
was simply
shoulders of
trying
his
to
dark
survive
coat.
another winter
Walter
morning.
waited beside him on the
Daniel
hallway
Brooks
carpet,
stood in the
wearing
narrow
a
kitchen of his
ridiculous
outside
blue winter
apartment,
jacket,
staring at the
clearly
coffee
purchased
maker
by
like
someone
it
who
had
cared more
personally
than the dog
betrayed him.
appreciated.
It
Walter
sputtered
looked
once,
offended by
coughed
the
steam,
entire experience,
then died completely.
"You look homeless."
Perfect.
Victoria said. He muttered under his breath.
You look unemployed.
Absolutely perfect.
Ethan answered.
Timing. For the
At
first
38,
time in weeks,
Daniel had
she
the kind of
laughed without
face life
forcing it.
carved instead of
Ethan
shaped.
stepped inside,
Sharp
while Walter
jawline hidden
immediately
beneath
wandered
uneven
toward the
stubble,
apartment windows.
tired gray
Nails
blue
clicking
eyes
softly
shadowed
against
by too
hardwood
many
floors.
sleepless nights.
The old dog
Dark
had
brown
grown
hair
thinner
that curled
recently.
slightly
His
at the
hips
ends
moved
because
slower
he
now,
never had time to cut
especially
it
during
properly
cold
anymore.
mornings.
He
But
was
his
broad
eyes
shouldered
still
from
tracked
years of
every
warehouse
sound in the
labor,
room with
but
stubborn
exhaustion had
attention.
thinned him recently.
Ethan removed his
pulling
gloves
tension
carefully,
tight across his features.
"You eating properly?"
People used to describe
That's a
him as
very parental
intimidating
question.
before they heard him speak.
You didn't answer it.
Then they
Victoria
noticed how
rolled
gentle
her
he
eyes
was
slightly
with everyone
and took the
except
coffee
himself.
anyway.
He had started
Especially
checking
with
on
his
her
daughter.
every few days.
After the
Dad?
lawsuit exploded
A small
publicly.
voice called.
Never dramatic.
Daniel
never
turned toward
invasive.
the hallway.
Just
as
present.
Lily Brooks,
It turned out
shuffled into the
consistency
kitchen,
felt stranger
wearing
to Victoria
oversized
than
pink
affection.
socks and a
"I
yellow
found a
sweater
building,"
covered in
Ethan
tiny
said.
embroidered
She
stars.
looked up immediately.
Lily was 8 years
"What kind
old,
of building?"
small for her age,
6-unit
with
residential
huge
property
brown
near
eyes
Bridgeport.
that somehow carried
Structurally
more
solid.
empathy than most
Needs
adults
plumbing,
Daniel
electrical
knew.
work,
Her
roof
long
repairs.
dark curls were
He
tangled
shrugged.
from sleep, and she
Nothing
clutched a
impossible.
stuffed rabbit named
Victoria
Olive against her
frowned
chest
slightly.
so tightly,
And
one of its ears permanently
the owner
leaned
wants
sideways.
to sell
because nobody
You're
thinks
supposed to
restoring
be
old
eating
housing
breakfast,
is profitable anymore.
Daniel said softly.
That sentence sat
I was
between
waiting
them
for
quietly.
you. Months
That
ago, Victoria
sentence
would have
alone
responded
nearly
with
broke
numbers,
him.
risk projections,
He looked toward the
market
clock on the
concerns.
microwave. Instead, she
7:12
asked,
a.m. How bad is
His
it?
interview at Hawthorne Dynamics
smiled
started at
faintly.
8 downtown.
Now you're asking
48
the right
minutes
question.
away in normal weather. 2 weeks
Today,
later, they
with
stood
snow
inside the
falling
building
sideways
together.
across
The
Chicago?
structure sat on a narrow side
Impossible.
street between a
His phone
laundromat and an
buzzed.
abandoned grocery
Ride
store.
canceled.
4 floors.
Daniel
Red
stared
brick
at the
darkened from
notification
age.
for a full
One
second
cracked
before
front window
laughing
covered
once under his
temporarily
breath.
with plywood.
Not because it was
Inside
funny,
smelled
because
like
if
dust,
he didn't laugh,
old
he
pipes,
might lose
and
his
cold
mind.
plaster.
Bad news?
But the foundation
Lily
held.
asked carefully.
Victoria walked
He hated
slowly
how
through the
careful
first floor
she'd become
hallway
these past
while
2
Ethan
years.
explained repairs.
Just
He
transportation
carried a
stuff,
flashlight
bug.
and clipboard
He
under one
forced a
arm.
smile.
Speaking
Nothing
with the calm
catastrophic yet.
concentration she had
She
first
climbed
seen at
onto
the
one of
gala.
the kitchen stools
Water
and
damage
studied
here,
him quietly,
he said,
while he refreshed
pointing upward.
the rideshare app again and
Roof
again.
leak traveled through the west
Surge
wall.
pricing
Wiring's
flashed across
outdated,
the
but
screen like an
salvageable.
insult. Victoria ran her
$93
fingers
for a
lightly across
20-minute
peeling
ride.
paint.
He had
Years ago, she would
$61
have
in his
demolished
checking
a place
account
like
until
this
Friday.
within a week. Daniel
Too
pressed
small,
both hands
too
against
old,
the counter and
not
closed
profitable
his eyes
enough.
briefly.
Now she
Divorce
kept
had
noticing
not ruined him
details
all at
instead.
once. It had
The
happened
handrails
slowly.
worn smooth
One
from
legal
decades
payment
of use.
one missed bill,
Children's height
one
marks
extra
still
shift,
visible near one apartment
cup
doorway.
snow hammered against
A
the
forgotten
streets
ceramic
of Chicago
flower
hard
pot
enough
sitting
to
inside a
erase the
dusty
skyline
window.
beyond the apartment
Signs
windows.
people had actually
The city
lived
looked
here.
blurred,
Not
cold
investors,
and exhausted,
not branding
like everyone
consultants.
inside it was simply trying
People.
to survive another winter morning.
Why this building?
Daniel
She
Brooks
asked.
stood in the
Ethan
narrow
adjusted
kitchen
the
of his
flashlight
south side
slightly.
apartment, staring
Because
at the
nobody
coffee
important
maker
wants
like it
it.
had personally betrayed
Something
him.
in her chest
It
tightened
sputtered once,
unexpectedly.
coughed steam.
By spring,
then
they
died
officially
completely.
opened the Hayes Restoration Fund.
He muttered under
Tiny
his breath
compared to what Victoria once
Absolutely
controlled.
perfect timing.
No corporate tower,
At 38,
no board,
Daniel
no
had the
gala
kind of
dinners,
face life
just
carved
a cramped
instead of
office
shaped.
above a hardware store.
Sharp jawline,
where pipes
hidden
rattled
beneath
whenever
uneven
somebody
stubble,
upstairs
tired
showered.
gray blue eyes.
Sarah
shadowed
joined
by
them
too
2
many
months later
sleepless nights.
after resigning
Dark
from
brown
Hayes
hair
Urban
that
Development.
curled slightly at the
She
ends
claimed it was because the
he
new
never had time
executive
to cut
team
it
wasn't
properly
competent.
anymore.
He was
Victoria
broad-shouldered from
suspected
years of
loyalty
warehouse
played
labor,
a larger
but
role than
exhaustion
Sarah
had
admitted.
thinned him recently.
Sarah looked
pulling
healthier outside corporate life somehow. People used to describe him as intimidating, cut her hair shorter near the shoulders. Started
then they noticed
without
how
sounding
gentle he was
permanently
with
exhausted.
everyone except himself.
You know, this office smells
Especially
like
with his
drywall
daughter.
and bad decisions.
Dad?
She muttered one afternoon
small
while
voice
organizing
called.
paperwork.
Daniel
Accurate
turned toward the
branding.
hallway.
Ethan
Just
replied
as
from
Lily
across
Brooks
the room.
shuffled
Walter
into the
slept
kitchen,
beneath the radiator
wearing
beside
oversized
them,
pink
old
socks
socks
and a
twitching
yellow sweater
occasionally
covered in
during dreams.
tiny embroidered
The project
stars.
stayed small. Lily was 8
Repairing
years old.
unsafe
Small
stairwells
for her age.
replacing faulty
with
heating
huge
systems,
brown eyes, restoring neglected apartments
empathy than
landlords
most
ignored
adults
because
Daniel
poor
knew.
tenants lacked
Her
legal
long
leverage.
dark curls were
No
tangled
magazine
from
covers
sleep,
followed,
and she
Victoria
clutched a
discovered
stuffed
she
rabbit
preferred
named
that.
Olive against her chest.
One
so
December
tightly,
afternoon,
one of its
nearly
ears
a year after
permanently
the
leaned
Meridian
sideways.
scandal,
Snow drifted
supposed to be
slowly
eating
across
breakfast,
the city, while workers
Daniel
removed
said
scaffolding
softly.
from a renovated apartment building on the
waiting for
west
you.
side. Victoria
That
stood beside
sentence alone
Ethan
nearly
across the
broke
street,
him.
watching quietly.
He looked toward the
She
clock
wore
on
a
the
dark
microwave.
wool coat instead of designer
7:12
dresses now.
a.m.
Her auburn
His
hair
interview
had
at
grown
Hawthorne
slightly
Dynamics
longer,
started at 8
usually tied
downtown.
back carelessly when she
48
worked.
minutes away in
The
normal
sharp edges
weather.
people once feared
Today,
in her
with
still
snow
existed,
falling
but
sideways across
exhaustion
Chicago,
no longer lived behind them.
impossible.
Construction workers
phone
laughed
buzzed.
nearby while
Ride
loading tools into
canceled.
trucks.
Warm
Daniel
yellow light
stared at the
glowed
notification
through
for
repaired
a
apartment
full
windows
second
above
before laughing
Real
once
windows.
under his breath.
Real families.
Not because it was
No
funny,
investor
because if he
presentation
didn't laugh,
attached. He might lose
Ethan
his
stood
mind.
beside her,
Bad
with
news?
both hands in his coat
Lily
pockets.
asked carefully.
More gray
He
had
hated
appeared in
how
his beard
careful
over the
she'd
past
become
year.
these past 2
The
years.
scar near his eyebrow
Just
looked deeper
transportation
during
stuff,
winter.
bug.
He
forced
seemed
a
calmer now
smile.
too.
Nothing
Not
catastrophic
happier
yet.
exactly.
She
Just
climbed onto one
less
of the
prepared
kitchen
for
stools
disaster
and
every
studied him
second.
quietly while he refreshed
Victoria
the
watched the
rideshare
building
app
for a
again
long
and
moment
again.
before speaking.
Surge pricing
Do you think
flashed
we
across
actually
the
did
screen
this
like
right?
an insult.
Ethan followed her
$93
gaze
for a
toward the finished
20-minute
structure.
ride.
He had
Snow settled
$61
softly
in
across
his
the
checking
sidewalk
account
between
until
them.
Friday. Finally,
Daniel pressed
he nodded
both
once.
hands against the counter and
At
closed
least nobody's
his
going
eyes
to die
briefly.
because of it.
Divorce had not ruined
Victoria
him all at
looked
once.
back at the building
it had happened
again,
slowly.
at the repaired
One legal
balconies,
payment,
the
one
reinforced
missed bill,
foundation,
one extra
the
shift,
lights turning
one
on
cup
room
snow
by room
hammered
as
against
evening
the streets of
approached.
Chicago hard
For
enough
years,
to erase
she had
the
confused
skyline
scale
beyond the
with
apartment
importance.
windows.
Bigger
The city
buildings,
looked
bigger
blurred,
deals,
cold,
bigger
and
headlines.
exhausted.
Like everyone
Standing
inside
there
it was
beside
simply
Ethan
trying
in
to
the
survive
freezing
another winter
Chicago
morning.
wind,
She
Daniel
understood how
Brooks
wrong
stood
she
in the
had
narrow
been.
kitchen of his
Because
Southside
this
apartment,
was
staring
the
at the
first
coffee
thing she had
maker
built
like it had
in
personally
years
betrayed him.
that allowed her to sleep
It sputtered
peacefully
once,
afterward,
coughed steam,
and somehow
then died
that
completely.
felt larger than
Perfect.
everything she had lost.
He muttered under his breath.
Sometimes God
Absolutely
doesn't change our
perfect
lives
timing.
through miracles that fall from
At
the sky.
38, Daniel had the kind of
Sometimes
face
he
life
sends
carved
people
instead
who
of
force
shaped.
us to see what we've
Sharp
become.
jawline hidden beneath
This story
uneven
is a
stubble,
reminder that success
tired,
means
gray
nothing
blue eyes
if we lose our
shadowed by
humanity
too
along
many
the way.
sleepless nights.
If this
Dark
story
brown
touched
hair
your
that
heart,
curled
share where
slightly
you're
at the
watching
ends
from.
because he
Leave a
never had time
comment
to
and
cut it
subscribe to the
properly
channel.
anymore.
He
May
was
God
broad
bless
shouldered
you,
from
protect
years of
your
warehouse
family,
labor,
and bring
but
peace
exhaustion
into
had
your
thinned
life.
him recently.